I'm just going to give it a minute or two for the participants to join in. Okay, so I think I'm going to begin. I think others will keep sort of trickling in as we go along. So very warm welcome, everyone, to the first event of this new academic year for the Climate Crisis Thinking in the Humanities and Social Sciences Research Network, which is hosted by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and supported by the Oxford Martin School here at the University of Oxford. My name is Nenika Mathur. I'm one of the conveners of this network, along with my colleague Amanda Power from the History faculty. So I'm really delighted to welcome you to this first Michaelmas event, which is going to be on communicating the climate crisis through wind and ice. And I'm absolutely delighted to have here sort of two of the most exciting anthropologists working on climate change and the Anthropocene, on environmental issues, etc. today. We have Professor Simony Howe and Professor Dominic Boyer. Both of them teach at Rice University. I'm going to just quickly introduce them before we sort of move over to their presentation. And then after that, we're hopefully going to have plenty of time for a Q&A. So very brief introduction. Professor Simony Howe is Professor of Anthropology at Rice University. Her books include Intimate Activism and Ecologics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, which follows the human and more than human lives intertwined with renewable energy futures. She's co-editor of the Johns Hopkins Guide to Theory, as well as this fantastic collection of short essays on the Anthropocene, which is entitled The Anthropocene Unseen, a Lexicon, which was published by Punctum Books earlier this year. Currently, her research is focused on adaptive responses to ice loss in the Arctic region and sea level rise in coastal cities around the world. Along with Dominic, she has also produced the documentary film, Not Orc, which is a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. Professor Dominic Boyer also teaches at Rice University, where he has served as the founding director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences. He's currently pursuing ethnographic research with flood victims in Texas and on electric futures across the world. His most recent book was Energopolitics, which was published by Duke University Press in 2019, and it is part of a collaborative duograph, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, which he co-wrote with Simony. This studies the politics of wind power development in southern Mexico. Now, both, you might actually, or even if you don't know their wonderful work, you might be familiar with this recent collaboration that they undertook with Icelandic collaborators, where they installed a memorial to the passing of a glacier. This is sort of the image which you can see this image as it's been advertised with this particular event. I believe they're going to talk a bit more about this as well as some of the other research on wind. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them. Thank you both so much for being here. I know it's bright and early, 8:30 in the morning where you are, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nayanika. We're really, really delighted to be here. We would rather be there with you in person, clearly, but there are circumstances that prevent us from doing so. However, we are saving some greenhouse gas emissions, so that's something that we can feel very ethically sound about. I wanted to quickly introduce the structure of the presentation. We'll be talking about two projects and their communicative impulses and logics. So we'll begin with the wind power project in Mexico, and Dominic will start us off with that. And then I will move into the research in Iceland and the Arctic. So we'll have a kind of a dual presentation here. And a couple of videos as we get further along. So okay, without further ado,
shift this over to me now. Turn that around and let's get into the slide deck. Let me just add my thanks as well to Nianika, to Nikki, to the rest of the organizers, and to say that we were commenting on this and we think that TORCH is possibly the best possible acronym for a humanities center. So kudos to you. What a great image, fire, pure fire. So I'm going to talk about our wind power research, but you'll see that I have it here titled as aeolian politics. And this is a concept that we developed in the course of the research to capture the complexity, the epistemic complexity, the political complexity, the ontological complexity of wind power. Wind power, I think, rolls off the tongue these days as a rather transparent, even salvational force, right? We're getting wind power to get us to wean ourselves off of carbon fuel, and thus we sort of can imagine this green capitalist, probably modernity stretching, infinitely into the future. But in fact, that's not what wind power is on the ground in a place like southern Mexico. So we took the term for wind power in Spanish, energía eólica, that gives us the aeolian, and the politics suggests that this is a dynamic process, and indeed a quite contentious and fraught process, not just in Mexico, but I think in many places in the world. And the images that I've collected here on this first slide sort of capture some of the complexity of it. In the upper left-hand corner, you have a sort of a speculative imaginary of a wind park that it turns out would never be made, and yet here it is sort of stretching into the distance, interestingly absolutely free of people and animals. It's just the pure technology and landscape. And below that we have the Mexican president Felipe Calderon, who was one of the great forces behind Mexico's wind power boom, talking about how this can be a win-win for the country. On the one hand, it both offers a path to the decarbonization of the electricity system and a way for combating the Anthropocene trajectory. On the other hand, it will bring prosperity and a kind of white-collar revolution to this historically very poor and very indigenous part of Mexico in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. On the right-hand side, you find images from indigenous peoples, Icots and Binisa, Wave and Zapotec peoples who have gathered together in a project of resistance against the rapid wind development on two grounds. One, that it participates in a long historical process of resource exploitation and dispossession of lands. They see the wind parks as part of a 500-year colonial venture, the critics do. And also something that deprives them in very immediate ways of potentially, through the industrialization of the landscape, through access to local agriculture, diminishing local food stocks, threatening access to crucial fishing grounds in a way that creates new kinds of existential precarity. So these are the sort of the terrain of aeolian politics that we're exploring. And this is just to give you a bit of orientation, the place that this concerns, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and you'll see from the satellite image that there's a gap in the Sierra Madres right here at this very tight belt in southern Mexico. And that gap in the Sierra Madres, because of the barometric pressure differential between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean, creates one of the most powerful natural wind tunnels on the planet. And in fact, the winds in this part of Mexico routinely achieve something like tropical storm force without there being any kind of cyclonic activity. So this is a wind that's powerful. It's known to some as the devil's wind, the El Norte, the north wind. And it is known to flip over tractor trailers and strip the paint off boats. And it's an amazing sort of ontological force, which we'll get back to a little bit later, in this part of Mexico. So already the wind itself is a big part of the politics. But to complexify the story that Calderon is telling us, we have to see that it's not just about decarbonization and fighting the Anthropocene, although we believe that Calderon was sincere in that intent. It's also about the fact that Mexico is a failing and increasingly vulnerable petrostate, as many are across the world. It's not something that people have talked as much about as they should, but what will happen to these governments that rely fundamentally on petroleum sales as those sales diminish through decarbonization of the economy or through failing resources. And in Mexico, it's what's really failing resources, particularly the exhaustion of the supergiant Cantarell field in the southern Gulf of Mexico. Mexican oil production, as you see in that left graph, has dropped 50% in less than 15 years. And Calderon told us in an interview we were fortunate enough to have with him that in fact 43% of Mexico's federal budget relies upon sales from Pemex, the parastatal oil utility. So think about that. All of the biopolitical aspirations and promises of the Mexican state rely very intimately and fundamentally upon oil sales. So the turn to electricity, it's true, it's about decarbonization, but it's also about this effort to kind of save every barrel of oil for export that's possible. In the right map there, you see a study that was done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States in association with some other partners. And that area in the right part of Oaxaca is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And the areas you see that are in red and that are in purple, which are most of that area, are in fact such powerful wind resources that they're off the charts. They're literally above the excellent category. Wind that's so strong, indeed, it's a bit too strong for conventional wind turbine technology. But this is the sort of the golden promise of Oaxacan wind, Ismeño wind, is that it could provide this massive energy resource, some of the best technical wind capacity in the world. There are three case studies that made up this project, and I just want to quickly talk about them. The first one is the Mirena Renovables Park, which was the one you saw in the image on the first slide. Would have been the largest single-phase wind park in Latin America. There's a great deal of capital, international investment capital, led by an Australian financial investment firm that would have funded this project. But in fact, it collapsed because it was slated to be built on collectively owned indigenous land. There were a lot of problems with the consultation process and the community engagement process. But what really broke the camel's back, so to speak, was the fact that they began to erect barriers near the western end of this sandbar, near the town of Álvaro Obregón, which was a town settled by the families of a very famous local military leader, and is known to be a very militant community. When they began to see barriers erected that would have prevented their access to their traditional fishing grounds around the sandbar, they immediately erected their own barricade and then prevented over a course of many months any kind of further development going on. This led to a massive crisis and incredibly complex politics that became violent in several instances that Simony ended up writing about in her book. The second case is the Ansa Ixtepec project farther northwest. And the Ansa Ixtepec would also have been a first of its kind, but the first community-owned wind park. Most of the wind parks in southern Mexico are PPP, private-public partnership parks. They're developed by international capital on behalf of major industrial interests in Mexico, with rents paid to local landowners and some small share, about 2% of the returns usually the profits going back to communities. The Ansa Ixtepec Park, built on the Danish model, would have offered more like 50% return of profits to the community, as well as a further 50% of the profits going to seed new community wind parks in Mexico and elsewhere. So it was actually meant as a project to transform the very nature of wind development in this part of Mexico. And for that same reason, saw massive resistance of a different kind, this time from the conventional wind industry in alliance with local and federal government officials who saw the current wind model as being a very, excellent way to attract foreign direct investment funds. And they didn't like the idea of communities trying to get into this game themselves, even though this park, Ansa Ixtepec, had a much higher degree of local acceptance than the other parks turned out to have. So you could say here is a failed effort to create a different kind of aeolic modernity. And then finally, Laventosa, which was one of two towns in the isthmus entirely circled by wind parks. So in the period of our research in 2012 and 2013, this small community of several thousand Ismeños came to be encircled on all sides by wind parks. And so we were very curious as to how people felt about this. So we with a small research team undertook a household to household, door-to-door survey, trying to talk with as many people as we could. And we ended up talking to some 40% of the the households in town by the end. And it turned out that there was a high degree of ambivalence about this, as you can imagine. People felt that, yes, the creation of the wind parks had brought some new jobs for a time, but actually the profits from the parks were mostly going to the already wealthy landowning class. There wasn't much trickle down. There weren't a lot of new opportunities because it doesn't take a lot of people to operate a wind park once it's constructed. So what they saw instead is that this wealth was being focused into vacation homes for the wealthy instead of creating the kind of development that had been promised. Nonetheless, in the course of again, less than a decade, the isthmus became the densest concentration of onshore wind parks anywhere in the world, 2.3 gigawatts of installed capacity in an area of only 450 square kilometers. There were plans to extend this to as much as 5 gigawatts, but those fell victim both to the renewed Mexican commitment to petroleum after Calderon of the last two presidencies, as well as the fact that the contentious politics on the ground were making Oaxaca less and less a sort of secure site for the investment of capital. So we have 2.8 gigawatts of installed capacity, which is still massive, an absolute transformation of the landscape. So I'll just very quickly talk about a couple of outcomes. This is just short sort of paragraphs from our final report. There's a lot of publications on this project too, if you're interested, and then get to the communication side of it. So speaking to the sort of public audience, this was federally funded research in the United States, so public outcomes report is part of what we do. While the government and renewable power companies have initiated a potentially powerful intervention into climate mitigation and adaptation, if they fail to fully involve local populations and account for an ongoing legacy of exploitation, they risk undermining the positive social and environmental contributions that low carbon initiatives typically seek. So again, the way in which communities, for the most part, especially indigenous communities, were cut out of the process of development, we found extraordinarily problematic. And then the success of renewable energy transition in Mexico and elsewhere will depend not only on technical and economic solutions for supplanting carbon energy use, but also on whether new energy projects can be enacted more equitably and with greater attention to local resource sovereignty than has been the case with fossil fuels. We went to Mexico as convinced renewable energy advocates. We returned from Mexico as convinced renewable energy advocates. But what we learned along the way is that it's very possible to make wind parks more or less wholly in the model of an extractivist, exploitative, transnational capitalist economy that very much is commensurate with fossil fuels. And so in a sense, wind parks were being laid into the grooves of development that the fossil fuels and mining operations of the past had laid. And it was quite tragic to us that many people would talk about wind parks and mines in the same breath, as though there was no real difference between these two forms of development in terms of their expropriation of indigenous sovereignty, of their sort of enhancement of social inequality and unequal redistribution of wealth and profits. And that image is from street art in the town of Laventosa that shows you this nightmarish vision of wind power as something where these towers are sort of presiding over an arid, desiccated landscape where the corn is no longer giving sustenance. This idea of wind power is something that robs the earth of its fecundity is something that we heard again and again in local knowledges. So I'll just two final slides. I want to talk briefly about two projects that we developed experimentally out of this research that are about climate communication. And the first is the more scholarly oriented one, I would say, the duograph. In the course of doing the research, Simony and I realized that, and again, 16 months of field research over a period of a couple of years, we came to realize that we actually had quite different analytical interests and stakes in this research. And we also realized that the project was so complicated, it would be poorly served by one book trying to sort of stuff everything into a conventional monograph. So the idea of the duograph is to allow two scholars or more, because it could be a triograph, you could imagine other iterations of this, in which we each develop our own sort of single authored account that's developed that's sourced from this same very rich ethnographic archive. Simony and I were involved in every step of the fieldwork experience together, and yet Simony wanted to write more about the more than human dimension of this project, the ecological dimension of the project, whereas I became very interested in the sort of the conventional political anthropology of it, as well as in trying to figure out how to create a political theory that was adequate to the Anthropocene. And so we have different foci, different analytics, and yet at the same time, both projects have some of the same people and some of the same events will happen. So there's a way in which you can crisscross between the two texts and read different renderings of the same events and persons through different analytical lenses, which has that kind of Rashomon effect that we think kind of gives a third dimension in some ways to the process. And it also is an effort, frankly, to outwit neoliberal audit culture. As you know, one of the big disincentives to collaboration is that you then have to sort of chop up the outcomes, the deliverables in neoliberal speak into, if two people write one book, well, then you each receive 0.5 books worth of credit, which is a terrible sort of structural disincentive to working together, which is we know what we should be doing, especially if we want to take on ambitious research projects. So in this case, yes, we each wrote our own book, we each got credit for our one book, but more importantly, we felt was this idea to kind of create a more elaborate and analytically diverse and heterogeneous reckoning with what, as I hope is obvious now, was a very complex and multidimensional situation. So that was one. And then the second project is the Wind House. And one of the great frustrations of writing about wind power is that you never feel the wind. And the wind is, as I said, is such a powerful force. It's the force of that wind informs and infiltrates every aspect of politics in the isthmus. And so in a way to talk about the wind and not to feel the wind really impoverishes the sensory experience. So we wanted to see if there was a way to bring the wind of the isthmus of Tehuantepec to other locations. And this was the experiment that we developed with the help of some marvelous collaborators, the Ethnographic Terminalia Collective, a group of anthropologists, artists, curators who've worked with a lot of other anthropologists to help them realize experimental projects. And what we did this was for the 2015 American Anthropological Association meetings in Denver, is to construct a house that could contain the Isthmian wind. The house is not itself is scaled actually to many of the smaller homes that we're familiar with in this region. And I'm going to play you a brief video clip in a second, but just in case there's lag or it's hard to get, I just want to describe quickly what you'll be seeing of the walkthrough of this exhibit. So as you enter the Wind House, you're already hearing a voice in the distance, a voice that's reading a poem. And as you enter into it, you feel a gentle breeze blowing across you. And in this first room, there is a video carousel of a lot of footage we found or recorded ourselves about the sort of the green capitalist, green modern, green industrial aspirations and promises of this development. All of the ideas that the government had pushed and other actors too had pushed, that this is a beneficial win-win-win form of development that helps Mexico address the Anthropocene, but also helps prosperity in this region. And it's a gentle breeze. As you turn the corner, you are then hit full on by a very strong breeze. We got the biggest fan we possibly could get. It meant renting it from a special effects warehouse in Los Angeles and having it shipped to Denver. We'll get into the carbon politics of that later, but we thought for this experiment it'd be worthwhile to try it. This fan blows right in your face, and you come and it's startling. And there in the second room, there's a second video carousel of footage of the resistance, of the protests, of the people speaking out against the injustices that have been associated with this kind of wind protest. And then it's a bit of a flustering experience, and you're sort of buffeted then out through the final door into where finally you find the source of the poem, which is the great Zapotec poet Victor Terán, who we recorded reading his poem both in the Zapotec language and in Spanish, called The North Wind Whips, which is talking about this, again, the historical sensory importance of the wind for the Ismeño Zapotec communities. And this is kind of what buffets you out. So the idea was to kind of create some way of joining together, if you will, the epistemic dimensions of this project together with the raw force of the wind itself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to play this, but I'm also going to try to put the link to it into the chat. So this will be a little bit complex, and we'll see if we can pull it off so that if you're having latency issues, you're able to watch it at home. Okay, so here is the link. Let me do that. And let's see if we can put this in the chat now. And I might have to stop the share. And here's the chat. And let's see if this works. Yes, okay, so we've got the link in the chat. I'm gonna go back to the share screen. Feel free to follow along on your own if you wish, but let's go ahead and play.
Okay, great. So we move now from the wind in Oaxaca to the ice in Iceland and to the story of a little glacier that was lost there. But we are also inviting you to make an analytic transition here as well, and that is from climate change mitigation as a way of observing these changes to climate change adaptation, which is the focus of this next project. So in 2016, I began a new ethnographic research project that considered how Icelanders are essentially contending with the loss of ice across their island, a country that they have lived in for the last 1,200 years. And in this project, I really honed in on the social meaning of ice in a place where cryospheres have dominated landscapes, it's shaped lives and conditioned encounters with land and resources and livelihoods. It really is a multidimensional examination of the social significance of ice, the values associated with it, and also the values that are associated with its expiration. It meant talking to people like Gudni Arnarsson, who is a sheep farmer who has lived his entire life with a glacier in his backyard. Gudni's family has been there for generations near Fláajökull, an outlet glacier of the giant ice cap Vatnajökull that covers about 10% of Iceland's surface. But it also meant talking to people like Helgi Bjornsson, who is a world-renowned glaciologist in Iceland, who's an expert on Icelandic glaciers and glaciology in general. And to scientists like Guðfinna Athelgeirsdóttir. Here she's recording an ablation event atop Sólheimajökull with a group of students whom she takes out every summer to observe the loss of ice as it melts across the Sólheim Glacier in Iceland. And Guðfinna explained to me when she spoke of climate change that this is the largest uncontrolled experiment that we humans have ever done. I think that this is a poignant way of imagining where we go in these Anthropocene times if we imagine ourselves in the midst of an experimental space and time. So as we went into the Iceland work, Dominic and I were both still working on our books about the wind project in Oaxaca, working on the introductions. And this was a very early stage of the melt research. But we were also looking for glaciers that were near Reykjavik, near the capital of Iceland, in order to visit them for ourselves. In the same way that we experienced wind in Oaxaca, we wanted to have an encounter with these cryospheres ourselves and to get to know them more personally and to have what we might call our own kind of cryo-human relationship. And one of us, while casting around on the internet one day looking for glaciers, found a very short news article, and I mean very short, 73 words long entirely, about a little glacier that was called Ok. So Ok Glacier, or Okjökull, because Jökull is the Icelandic word for glacier, had this truly endearing name for English speakers, clearly, because it resonates with the English word okay. But what the article said about Okjökull is that it was a glacier no more, that it had lost so much of its icy corpus and its mass that it could no longer be considered a glacier. It could no longer move, and thus now was only what glaciologists call dead ice. What that short article also said, that Ok was the first of Iceland's major glaciers to disappear, or to be killed, if you will, by climate change, and yet no one seemed to have noticed or paid much attention at all, not in Iceland and not anywhere else either, as far as we could find. So this little discovery led, to our surprise, to many other bigger things that we hadn't really expected, but that occurred nonetheless. One of those things was our decision to make a documentary film about this little glacier that had died. So we came back the following summer and working with an Icelandic cinematographer, Ragnar Hansson, who we told about the project. He was very excited to do it. And so we spent this summer interviewing Icelanders, speaking with them about their thoughts and reflections and encounters with cryospheres and the loss of them, and created a documentary film, which of course we needed to call Not Ok, or Not Okay, a little glacier, about a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. We wanted to create a kind of a biopic, a sort of biography of this little glacier that had died, to find its story and then also to be able to tell its story in a compelling way to a larger audience, we believed, than was possible with yet another academic article that we might write about the loss of cryospheres and the conditions of Anthropocene living. So as we went about making the film, we also learned fascinating things about this little dead glacier, Okjökull. We learned from an Icelandic linguist, for example, that Ok can actually write its own name. And as the linguist told us, that's pretty unusual for a mountain to be able to write its own name. So in ancient Icelandic, Ok would not have been spelled OK, it would have been spelled OC. And here at the crater of Ok mountain, you can clearly see the outline of the crater makes for an O, and then the interior of the former volcano, the rocks in the center here make a C. And so indeed, Ok Mountain is spelling its own name. We also met people like Jóhanna Thorvaldsdóttir, whose goat farm sits at the base of Ok Mountain. And by reading the top of Ok Mountain, reading the snow, the ice, the reflection off the top of the mountain, Johanna told us that she is able to predict the next day's weather. So Ok Mountain served as a kind of weather forecaster for local people who knew how to read it in the proper way. Johanna is also a now famous goat farmer in Iceland. She's responsible in part for preserving the Viking lineage of the Icelandic goat, which almost went extinct at some point. But Johanna is a great lover of goats. And some of her goats, we learned in our conversations with her, actually starred in early episodes of the Game of Thrones series. So she has some TV star goats herself. And talking with Icelanders about their knowledge about Okjökull, about Ok Mountain and the loss of it, we kept returning to questions about how to acknowledge the death of something that was never really, in truth, alive. Would it be right, we thought, would it be correct to create a memorial for such a thing, for Okjökull? And if so, what kind of form might that memorial take? And indeed, again, would anyone care? Because there had been little attention paid to Okjökull's death in the original instance in 2014. We wondered if anyone would care at all. But that question kept driving at us. Can we memorialize, should we memorialize something which never actually lived? Along the way, in making the film and speaking with Icelanders, we couldn't help but notice that there's a thriving glacier tourism industry in Iceland. And one of the ironies for us in doing this research and knowing what we do about climate change is that Iceland, of course, is swiftly losing its glaciers at a rate of 11 billion tons per year, none of which are expected to return anytime soon. So in keeping with our understanding of the Anthropocene and climate change effects, we thought it would be much more appropriate to have something like an unglacier tour rather than simply glacier tours in Iceland. And in 2018, we worked with the Icelandic Hiking Society to create the Unglacier Tour, which we were able to host in the summer of 2018, right after the premiere of our Not Ok or Not Okay film. So on that day, after the premiere of the movie, we took a bus to the highlands, to the edge of the highlands, about an hour and a half outside of Reykjavik. And then we went with about 50 people up to the crater of the mountain, to the top of Ok Mountain, to see the site where Okjökull once existed. And we asked everyone on the tour, on the hike that day, to please keep an eye out for a rock, a majestic rock, a majestic stone that could be worthy of a memorial plaque for a fallen glacier. And as you see, we found it. As one of the Icelandic hikers said, this rock is straight from central casting. It has all the robustness and the personality that you would hope for in a rock that would host a memorial to the first of Iceland's major glaciers to be lost to climate change that we hope to create for Ok. In developing the plaque and the memorial, we asked the amazing Icelandic author Andrésar Magnusson if he would write the words, and he agreed to. As you see, it is a letter to the future, written first in Icelandic and then in English. And the letter to the future reads that Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. And it's dated August 2019 with the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that was recorded at that time, 415 parts per million. So this rather simple and poetic message began to circulate widely in social media, over Twitter, for example. And the idea for the world's first memorial for a fallen glacier, a glacier killed by climate change in a country called Iceland, no less, seemed to strike a chord globally. And we began to see in the early weeks after Rice University put out a press release that some local venues in Iceland picked up the story, as did others. And within another few weeks, it had become the subject of many, many outlets all over the world, categorized under this idea of scientists memorializing the first glacier lost to climate change in Iceland, showing up in many, many different languages. And you may have seen it. The Guardian covered the story quite a bit. The BBC covered it quite a bit. Here in the United States, it appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Times and Time Magazine and People Magazine. It appeared on television, on BBC, on NBC, Australian television, the Weather Channel. We saw footage on Indian television in Germany, Switzerland, radio in Ireland, in the United States, again in the BBC. It was a story that really caught fire in a sense, even though it was a tragic story about the loss of this little glacier. We began to see these headlines that were appearing in languages that we couldn't quite decipher ourselves, though we recognized the name Okjökull throughout. And the story appeared in conventional mainstream media outlets, but it also appeared in more unusual places like the US-based magazine Popular Mechanics, which is a kind of gearhead auto magazine for auto enthusiasts, and Elle magazine, a fashion and beauty magazine. So it had this resonance that was quite surprising to us, but that seemed to carry it all over the world all of a sudden. We even shared the front page with our former president on the cover of CNN and then the New York Times. So meanwhile, while the media buildup was occurring, we also learned that the Icelandic prime minister would be coming to our little ceremony on top of the mountain, our little funeral for the glacier. So it had become a really expansive act of public mourning, but one that was really oriented toward action rather than complacency. And during the Q&A here, maybe we could talk a little bit more about the resonance of what began as a very small project about a little mountain that few seemed to care about a little glacier that died that was unrecognized, but then all of a sudden everyone seemed to care a little, as Ok Mountain might put it. I wanted to show you the video too as well. So, oops, I'm going to try and do the same thing that Dominic did. If you were, maybe I will, maybe I won't. I need to stop share, I think. Okay, let's see if I can get this to come over into the chat. Go over here. And I'll give you a couple of minutes if you want to go and look at that video. Right. So, what I'm not seeing. Can you come back over here? Oh, I need this. Okay, so hopefully you were able to click on that and see that 2-minute video. That was a compilation from, I think AP put that together as this kind of screener for different television audiences. So finally, we wanted to close, and I'll bring Dominic back into the picture here. We wanted to close with our next up projects, and I'll very quickly talk about Mount Rise. Mount Rise is a project that comes out of the Icelandic research, which was about the loss of cryospheres and adaptation to that, and that project was called MELT. This next project takes into consideration adaptation, politics, and practices of sea level rise caused by cryospheric melt. And it's based around a tool that's been developed by NASA, a team of physicists called the Gradient Fingerprint Map, which allows us to calculate very precisely where particular sites of ice loss then manifest as sea level rise in 293 of the world's coastal cities. So we can see, for example, and this is what you see in the images here, that the melt of Iceland, that cryospheric loss, impacts the city of Cape Town, South Africa, more than any other city in the world. And as you know, these are very distant cities with very little connection between them, either through history, trade, migration, commerce, language, etc. Very, very different places in very different continents. And yet they are linked through their water. They're linked through meltwater and sea level rise. And so the Melt Rise project is to try and understand the different adaptation practices occurring both in places of melt and in places of sea level rise. And a public facing orientation that hopefully will come out of that project is what we're calling sibling cities of climate change, or sister cities of the Anthropocene, or maybe sibling cities of the Anthropocene, to try and draw out that very explicit connection that's quite counterintuitive, that these two places would be linked in this way, but in the processes of climate change they are. And so by creating something like a sibling cities program, instead of basing it on shared histories or political factors, that's the conventional form for sister cities, this is a way of connecting them through the effects of climate change and the Anthropocene conditions, and through a concept that I'm calling hydrological globalization, or a new form of globalization that occurs through the effects of climate change and changes to cryospheres and hydrospheres. So that's one project that we're very excited about. Hopefully we'll be undertaking as soon as we are freed to do so.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Do you want me to do the last slide?
Yeah.
And the other thing we're working on, which is really a reach, but I think part of what we would say is, if you're gonna be, if you want to do climate communication, you can't be afraid of changing media sometimes. And so what we're working on also is a screenplay for a TV series, which we're calling Petropolis, which is focused on Houston, which remarkably, despite being the 4th largest city in the country, has never had a scripted series set here. And that's a remarkable omission, or is it an omission? Maybe it's a strategic erasure, because what Houston represents above all is petromodernity and the coming reckonings with petromodernity. And so this is a TV series that is about how oil and power both unite a city and destroy it at the same time. And so we're interested in this, among other reasons, that TV is a kind of affective medium, as I'm sure all of you know, an intimate medium. And I think that there are ways in which you can write, do good storytelling that can also get people to think about the affective intensities of petroculture in new ways, and perhaps prompt some kinds of more, sort of communicative engagements with that, epistemic ruptures in that too. So, it's our effort, sort of with the Glacier Memorial, to kind of try to come at this from a different direction, and also have the fun of learning a new medium along the way. So I guess that's it. Is that it?
That's it.
All right, we're stopping our share. Now it's up to you guys.
We're excited to hear questions and thoughts.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Simony and Dominic. This was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. I loved hearing about both the earlier projects as well as a peek into what you're doing in the future. I might kick off with a few questions while we're waiting for others to gather their thoughts and come up with questions. So I guess one of the things I really appreciate in the work that you're doing on the Anthropocene is how the two of you are able to combine the more quote unquote traditional forms of academic knowledge production, such as the monographs or the duographs, with much more public facing work. And what was really fascinating in your talk today is that you're not just doing one thing. You've done you've done an installation, you've gone and put in a memorial, which has been picked up by the media all over the world. Now you're working on a play. I mean, you worked with artists, you collaborated with scientists. It's sort of incredible how you're able to do these sort of collaborations across many, many different kinds of individuals and communities. And I was wondering whether with both of those projects in Mexico as well as in Iceland, was this something that you guys had designed from before in your research, or is it something that sort of just happened? So for instance, when you talked about the Okjökull Glacier, was it that you just came across that 73-word article and then things took on from there, or was there more of a design there? And the second sort of related question is really, I'm really interested in thinking about questions that both of you have been engaging for much longer and much more nuanced ways, which is how does anthropology as a discipline, or the academy, but specifically anthropology as a discipline, which has traditionally been rooted in place and expertise in language and space, etc. How do we recast it to be able to speak more strongly to the Anthropocene? And again, in your duograph, you both have done that in very different ways. But I'm thinking now also of this new work, say on the sibling cities of the Anthropocene, where you're working in very different sites. And I just wondered about your experience of doing this kind of fieldwork, where you've worked in Iceland, you worked in Mexico, you might be working in Cape Town and Houston. How does it sort of, what kind of challenges does it pose to sort of the traditional Malinowskian idea of, going off to this remote island and sitting there for 3 years and then coming back? So just any thoughts you sort of had on these two, on this more sort of public facing work, as well as sort of this multi-sited field work, the new forms of fieldwork demanded in the Anthropocene. And then I'll take questions. I can see we've already got some in the Q&A popping up.
I'll answer either. You want to start? Which one do you want to?
You can start.
Which one do you want to talk about?
Whichever. We're probably both going to respond to both.
Oh, okay.
Very efficiently, but we will.
I'll say to the first question, which is great. I don't think that there was any grand strategy. I think it's been a sort of experimental feeling forward process. But I do think that both of us, have a certain restlessness, I guess, with respect to medium that has been allowed, fortunately, to manifest now in different kinds of communicative experiments. And I'll add to that the podcast, which we were talking about before we went live today,
Yes.
200 episode podcast, not to promote, only as a segue to talking about something that one of our guests, Jason De Leon, who's done marvelous work in the killing fields of the southwestern United States and the borderland regions. One of the things he said, because he's also done similar work, he's done traveling exhibitions, he's a musician. We've had sort of a conversation about sort of multimodal anthropology today, and I think what he said very well is he said, the key to it is not to imagine you have to learn all these skills yourself. The key thing is to understand that there are creators out there already who have these skills, who are really interested in the kind of work you do, in the stories you want to tell. And so really the part of it it's very doable. I mean, and you will learn skills along the way, which is great. It's like an added benefit, but it's not necessary to, for example, know how, to make a podcast to sort of participate in that, or even how to make a glacier memorial. It's about sort of a willingness to reach out to people and sort of have conversations about, can we, find the right kind of artistic, sort of scholarly collaboration here that will allow that to go forward. And I guess collaboration would also be my answer to the second question too, which is that I think, collaborative anthropology is so essential to anything we want to do in the Anthropocene, collaboration with other anthropologists, but then much more broadly too. So, yeah.
And it's, working in collaboration with artists and others actually enriches and expands the project itself. It actually makes for a better object or product or experience, at the end of the process. For example, asking André Snyder Magnusson to write the words for the Okjökull Memorial, I mean, we did that out of an anthropological logic that says we should not impose our colonial imperial English language voice on top of a mountain in Iceland. Like, there's a very kind of colonial imprint that might have. So we were very attuned to that, to the politics of two American academics coming to Iceland and placing this plaque on top of a rock. So we took the time and got permissions from the environmental authorities in Iceland, and that took a long time, but we really wanted to ask Andre to write the words, and they're beautiful, powerful words, and we could not have done better, not even close. And so having him, you know, someone who is a poet and a writer and Icelandic, made all the difference, I would say. And then in thinking about Anthropocene research, I mean, as with the wind project, these issues are so complex and so knotty and so entangled, if you will, that we really feel that we do need more people working collaboratively together in order to untangle the many threads of concern that appear in each of these cases, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. The complexities are such that we need more minds and more time spent doing fieldwork in order to create a more fulsome picture of what's occurring and to create the kinds of public facing elements that will attract attention and that will hopefully inspire broader publics to be invested in responding to climate change and Anthropocene conditions, which is what we truly need them to do.
Yeah. No, thank you. I'm so glad both of you are stressing the collaboration point, because that is something that, we've been trying to do with our network here in Oxford, where you have these incredibly talented people, but they're sort of spread all over the place and we never get to meet or do anything together. So it's deeply inspiring for us to actually hear about the incredible work the two of you have been doing. I should say, for those of you who haven't heard this podcast previously, I was sort of addicted to it for a while. I think you said you were running it for 4 years. Is that right?
We have 200 episodes.
Wow, 200 episodes. And it's obviously still there on.
It's still there. It's still there and it's searchable. So we can send you the link. And yeah, please go and listen. We have fantastic people on the podcast, a whole variety of topics, and you can go in and search for names. You can search for topics.
Right. Brilliant. That was
good. It's good. It's good lockdown listening.
Yes.
yeah. It's really good.
There's not one mention of COVID in the whole podcast. No. We can promise you. No,
but you go listen to the episode after Trump was elected. We're literally in tears as we're trying to process that.
Oh, yeah, and congratulations.
Maybe too soon. We're not done with him quite yet.
But I love the point when Simony was like, a former president. I was like, yes, there's hope for the planet now because he is a former president. Yeah. I should also say that, when Simony and Dominique were co-editing Cultural Anthropology as part of a wider collaborative, you guys did a lot to make Cultural Anthropology, the journal, much more publicly accessible through the change in the website and the new forms in the website and the shorter pieces that came up that allowed anthropologists to respond to what was happening immediately, right? Like the hotspot section, etc. And I think that was a really important moment again, because it allowed us to think quickly and write in different forms for more public audiences. So I can see that this whole thing of communicating your work has been very much part of your collaborative research for a long time. And, it's fantastic, especially in this moment. Okay, so I can see the questions are sort of, so the name of the podcast from Alexis Powell, he's asking about that. Maybe we can just put the link in the chat box.
Yeah, and it's called Cultures of Energy.
Yes.
So if you just Google Cultures of Energy podcast, it will come up.
Right. It's on Apple Podcast. Yeah. It's on Stitcher. A lot of the major.
But if you go to the website, you can search.
Yes.
Which is nice.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm going to read out the questions because I think everyone can't see them. So our first question is from Tim, who says, thanks so much for the talk. I'm really interested in your question of whether or not we can mourn or acknowledge the death of something that was never alive. Can you say a bit more about how you came to a decision about this? Is there something here about the importance of anthropomorphizing entities such as glaciers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can start with that. Sure. I mean, there is of course a history in Iceland of beings that occupy spaces like glaciers and the highlands. And this is in some ways in the historical past, but also in many ways in the present for Icelanders, that there is a kind of association with glaciers and terrifying beings on the one hand, but also very knowledgeable ancient beings on the other. It's not quite the kind of earth beings that you might find in some other indigenous contexts. I'm thinking of Marisol de la Cadena's work in South America, where you have mountains that have a kind of sentience to them. But there is an association in Iceland between the highlands, between glaciers and other living beings. So I think that's part of what we drew from. But more so than the kind of folkloric tradition was the scientists and the kind of language that they use to speak about glaciers. So the language that's used in the scientific community is very vital in a sense. And they talk about, you know, the bodies of glaciers and how they move across the land. In fact, a definition of a glacier is that it can move over the land. Part of that has to do with gravity, but most of it has to do with the mass balance, the mass of ice as it's able to crawl over the land and sort of consume the land beneath it. So Okjökull Glacier, when it was a glacier no more, could no longer move. So it had been stopped in its tracks. Its vitality had been sapped away and its movement had been sapped. And so things like glacial tongues and glacial toes, these sort of corporeal terms that are used by glaciologists are also quite fascinating and associated with more biologically vital entities. So I think these are some of the ways that we began to think of a glacier as having some sort of vital elements to it, even though it is not in the classic sense alive. It does have mobility and it does have these ascriptions of vitality. And it was gone. And so there were different ways of memorializing. We talked about doing something more like a scientific plaque that would have been something like you might find in a national park that talks about the details and, you know, the sort of facts about Oak Mountain and its history. That was one idea. We kind of talked about doing something like an address plaque, which is very popular in Iceland, sort of naming who lived here once. So we went through a few different iterations before we finally landed on the memorial plaque. And we based it on the memorials that we saw around Reykjavik. So they have these historic memorials, as we do everywhere. And part of the reason for moving towards the memorial also, I think, and I think this only came in retrospect, was that everyone on the planet recognizes a memorial, right? We have them everywhere. They're a universal, ubiquitous form of recognition. And usually that recognition has to do with the loss of life in war, for example, in a war memorial, like I think of the Vietnam Memorial here in Washington, DC, or conversely, it's a recognition of some great accomplishment, some human accomplishment, usually a white man on a horse, maybe with some kind of instrument or implement in his hands.
A hat.
No, and a hat, yeah. And very regal and someone who you literally need to look up to. So those are the forms that are familiar. Those are the familiar memorial forms. So we wanted to also kind of undercut that logic, undercut that ethos with this memorial, which is in one way a recognition of human accomplishment, right? The killing of a glacier, something that we humans collectively did. So it is an accomplishment of a sort, but it's not one that we should feel proud about. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think there's a lot of kind of symbolic resonance that gets wrapped up in these things too, and many ways that we can interpret them and then try and spell that out to a larger public as well.
And maybe it's like just a short-winded addendum to that. I mean, I think it's significant, you know, that there was a group in Switzerland that was planning a memorial for the Pizzol Glacier at exactly the same time that we were planning the Oak Memorial Glacier, and neither of us knew what was going on. Yeah. And I feel like this is one of those moments, like, you know, the dual invention of calculus, where something kind of has to happen. It's a moment when people are, the scale of loss has come to a point where people need to invent new rituals of mourning. And that's all we were doing. I think is channeling that need in a certain way and curating a little bit. And so the fact that now we're beginning to see new kinds of memorializations elsewhere, as well as new kinds of legal recognition for natural bodies, I think is something that I find is a really encouraging, you know, those kinds of communities of mourning and recognition that could create, I feel, are the basis of the kind of political communities capable of real change.
It's fascinating. So, you know, I've been pronouncing it as okay glacier, and I thought it was an ironic take on the fact that this poor glacier is obviously not okay because it dead. So it's good to know it was awkward. You're right. That's sort of the double ways in which it's operating. That name is also fascinating.
That's the other thing that made this so resonant. I mean, Andre's words are spectacular, but the name of the mountain and the glacier itself has a lot to do with the circulation of the story.
That's right.
If this glacier had a more traditional, very, very long Icelandic name, I don't think the story would have circulated in the way it did.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a dark humor, but there's something funny about the fact that Ok is not Ok anymore, that OK Glacier is no longer OK.
Yeah. Right? In fact, I think the first time I heard about it was not in the Guardian or the BBC, but in a Hindi news channel. And they had written it as OK, like English OK. So it's sort of interesting to think about how much that story circulated, because as you were saying, it really caught, the point you're making, Dominic, as well, about that we have to find new rituals to deal with the massive loss that we're in right now. And obviously this really resonated very powerfully around the world in some ways. So yeah, really fascinating to also think about what your collaborative experiments are then leading to themselves, right? To empirically, sort of ethnographically follow those results of your collaborations is fascinating. Okay, so our next question is from Stephen Maine, who says, this was a really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. He's asking, please, could you explain a little bit more about the connection between the towns and cities in Iceland and South Africa, and whether the populations of these places are able to affect these changes in any way, or whether both are effectively victims of activities that the rest of us are collectively responsible for?
Yeah, that's a really important insight and thought. So the Melt Rise project is currently in development and waiting for funding from the National Science Foundation. So we haven't been able to begin that full project. My sense, in just reading about this and speaking to people in Iceland, and we haven't yet made the trip to Cape Town, is that there is no kind of knowledge or association between these two phenomena, that is melting ice becoming sea level rise in Cape Town, South Africa. So part of the awareness will be created once the research is done and we're able to create the sibling cities program, if we're able to do that, the sister cities of the Anthropocene program, to kind of draw attention between those relationships. However, Simon, I think it was, brings up a really good point in our collective responsibility. A truly amazing project where we're able to take it to the next dimension would be to move beyond simply melting ice and rising seas and look at the sources of that melting ice and thus rising seas. So you might have a kind of a geometric relationship of hydrological globalization that links a place like Houston with its petro industry and as the petropolis for the Western Hemisphere and the production of fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions, and how these three places can be connected in a larger paradigm of Anthropocene occurrence. That would be a fantastic project, complex in so many ways, to figure out exactly and precisely, how the emissions that are released in one place or processed in the case of Houston become melted ice in the Arctic or other glacial basins, and then how they become sea level rise in the world cities. The nice thing about the NASA tool is that it allows for that precision. It allows for us to see the loss of mass essentially in one place. And again, the GFM tool doesn't just look to the Arctic. You can also see ice loss in every glacial basin on Earth. So we can look at Antarctica, we can look at the Andes, we can look at the Himalaya and see where their impact is occurring too. Yeah, and so I guess in closing that question, the awareness is not there that I know of, but hopefully it will become so. And in terms of responding to it, they're very different effects. The loss of ice and sea level rise will require different infrastructural, cultural, social, economic responses to it. But part of the project will be to see if there are any companion kind of adaptation practices that these two places might share with each other.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Stephen, for the question. Our next question is from Carl Schoenfeld, who says, great to hear about the TV series. On another talk, I also heard that both Handmaid's Tale and Chernobyl had scientific expert advice to enrich the story. So these connections are of growing importance. From your perspective, what is particularly valuable to include in a story? And how do you see this ultimately evolving into action?
Well, that's great. That's a great question, Carl. We've thought a lot about it. We've done a lot of background research. I mean, living in Houston, the ambient understanding of the dynamics of energy systems and energy industry here is sort of at another level because everyone is only 1 degree separated from one of the 5,000 energy companies that are based here. So in part, one of the things we wanted to do with Petropolis is actually try to, in a sort of non-caricatured way, show what the oil industry is, how it operates, its understanding of its own imminent decline and downfall. It's a really fascinating moment to think about this because this city, I think, has more engineers per capita than anyone in the world because of the combination of NASA, the medical center here, and then the oil industry. And so you have a lot of knowledge, and so I think that part of what we want to capture is that. But the other thing that's really critical are the various forms of precarity. And that's why I think that Chernobyl is a really great analog. This is a city filled with disasters. Disasters happen with a sort of striking routine occurrence, explosions in the ship channel, everyday toxicity experienced by fence line communities around. There are neighborhoods in Houston that are unbelievable. It's like Mordor. I mean, that there are homes and schools directly next to refining facilities because of the lack of any kind of zoning or urban planning here. So even just the kind of the landscape of it is something that we want to communicate. And, I think the storylines as we built out the season 1 arc, spoiler alert, involves both the kinds of precarity that are created by explosions and by the sort of the intimate relationship between humanity and this petroleum technoscape that exists here, but also about the longer term consequences via climate change and the fact that Houston is also in a hurricane zone, and so that there are we're both again creating this sort of economic vitality on the one hand, but also creating the conditions for warming oceans, more active cyclones, and this at the end of a record-breaking Atlantic hurricane season. In so many ways, it's sort of there's a certain kind of terrifying poetry to it all, how Houston is literally destroying itself as well as the world. And so that's all the backdrop. And I think you're right that having experts of various kinds come on to enrich the stories is really important, because these, TV does social theory. I mean, we can deny it as much as we want to, but TV is this kind of everyday social theory that's out there all the time. I think it behooves us to try to engage as scholars more in that process, because so many people are learning the stories and narratives and the discourse through popular entertainment, and it hits them emotionally too in ways that I think that's part of what we've realized along the way is that multimodal anthropology has an ability to affectively impact people in ways that maybe traditional scholarship it's harder for it to do. This is something that anthropologists have been doing a long time, working through poetry and other sorts of media. But it just seems to me that if you're working on these many challenges of our times, that turning to a kind of a more affectively enriched anthropology is something that's very worthwhile to try to do.
And there's also, television is doing social theory, media is doing social theory, but there's also evidence that it has social effects and social impacts. I mean, I'm thinking of the television show Will and Grace that was so popular here in the United States, like 20 years ago. But there's communication studies and scholarship that show that after Americans watching a decade of Will and Grace, inviting them into their living rooms, every Tuesday or whenever it was, actually created more tolerance and appreciation for gay and lesbian people. It actually had an effect on the kind of degree of homophobia that people were willing to share with researchers and pollsters. So if we take that as a kind of cognate, perhaps sort of unveiling, the real ugliness of the oil industry and how it seeps into all of our lives in these very nefarious ways, through the wealth that's produced in Houston, but also through the toxicity that it produces, may be a way of, shifting the conversation in an unconscious way for people who engage with the show and who fall in love with the characters. And there's lots of drama. We have a family drama that's occurring, and we have there's action, there's drama. I mean, it's got the kind of conventional things that we would expect in a television show, and we've been really working hard and found some other people to connect with too who've been working in the industry. And our hope and expectation is that if we're able to get this show off the ground, at least in the initial stages, that we would be able to work with a writer's room and kind of step back and be there to sort of, develop it from backstage, but to really bring in writers who know how to really do dialogue and to kind of capture the essence of what we want to capture in Petropolis, because that's the sort of driving force behind it, is to send a message, but not in a didactic way. I mean, it's pedagogical, but not didactic, I think is what we're trying to aim for. And I'm reminded too of, we did an interview with a media maker who had worked for the BBC for many years. And I remember on the podcast, we had a conversation with him, and he said that one of his hopes and desires was to insert some kind of messaging about climate change and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions into every single television show that's produced by BBC. I mean, imagine it, that they're in every show, there's some sort of recognition. People are driving electric cars, maybe there's some sort of disaster or a drought, to get it into the public sphere in that way, in a really comprehensive and ubiquitous way. So I don't know, I think that's part of the inspiration too, is thinking through that possibility, is how do we get these stories out there in a way that people are entertained by, that they'll consume without realizing that they're learning something at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds fantastic. So our next question is from Steve, who's saying, that was fascinating. Thank you. You mentioned the tricky issues of flying, transporting fans, carbon emissions associated with research and the politics around this. I wondered if you could say a bit more about your thinking around this issue. That is a tricky issue. I can see our next question is from Hannah Knox, who's actually stopped flying because of carbon emissions. She's got this fantastic sort of, we'll come to Hannah in a minute, but yeah. So this is
Hannah. Hi, Hannah.
Hey, yeah, I mean, for this project, a small project, it only ran for 5 days. I think we thought of it as more of a prototype than a sort of fully finished, the wind house that is, fully finished project. And I think, the real question is, I mean, we did things like, there are the carbon emissions in flying this, in transporting the fan, for example, that probably were other ways around that. If we had, getting a hold of huge fans is not as easy as you would think, as it turns out, and a lot of them are oil powered, diesel powered, so that wasn't going to work in an interior space. But we had things like triggers, like motion sensor triggers, so the fan would be running all the time to try to minimize the impact. And you have to be very thoughtful about it, I think, is just try to reduce wherever possible. But to the sort of issue, the broader issues of academic life, and it's very high carbon, especially when people are flying around the world. I think that is something that's a real issue. The fact that, and the COVID will certainly accelerate this, the openness, the familiarity with more online modalities of gathering that, especially the Society for Cultural Anthropology through its conferences like Distributions had done to try to pioneer models of gathering that actually then removed many of the barriers to participation of scholars from the global South too, where you had active participants in Tunisia and Ethiopia that would probably not have ever been able to make it to the United States to participate in a traditional conference.
Right, because of the expense, because of visas, because of travel. I mean, it really opened up the space for that conference. So there's something to be said about sort of online intellectual life that is beneficial.
That said, the real reason for it is to make more intimate connections with people. And that's, what we're really missing is a chance to have dinner with Neanika later on, and that's a real loss. I think that has to be understood to be a real loss, because I firmly believe that transportation has real positive benefits in terms of creating the kinds of cross-national, cross-local connections that we need to work together as a species to overcome things like climate change. So I think that we have to think not just to sort of demonize all kinds of long-form transportation, but rather to get really aggressive about demanding lower carbon alternatives. Decarbonizing air transport is a huge area of research now, and that's something that only can to bring positive things down the road. And so I'd say, it's about being mindful and thinking about what the real trade-offs are in all of these cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a fraught issue, and I completely see the pros and cons of the online conferencing and research stuff, the complex issues. I really actually liked Hannah's writings on why she stopped flying. So the next question is actually from Hannah Knox from UCL, who says, thanks for your talk. Were you surprised that the memorial plaque was so effective in capturing the public imagination? And reflecting on this, how are you planning to build on what you learned about communication in your future projects?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of sociality, I'm remembering the time that we had a pint with Hannah, at least one in Durham, England. Remember that?
That was Manchester.
No, well, maybe in Manchester too.
We had 2 pints, 2 separate occasions.
Keeping track of the pints. Okay.
The pints are critical. Huh? The critical collaborative work happens around these pints and dinners. Yeah.
It totally does. So yeah. Here it's only 10 a.m. so we won't talk about pints. That's a great question, Hannah. We were utterly shocked at the amount of attention that this plaque and this memorial service received. I mean, as I mentioned, Rice University sent out a press release and they sent it to the Icelandic media. And we thought that the Icelandic media would show up for the event, that we might get Icelandic television if we were lucky, because honestly, there's not that much news in Iceland on any given day, and it was the middle of summer. But the kind of outpouring of attention was really quite surprising to us. And, it kind of began with some tweets from someone who saw the reportage, and then evolved into this sort of large story that kept spinning and spinning for a few months. I mean, it went on in this iterative way, where the first press release went out that scientists were going to memorialize this glacier loss to climate change. Luckily, we get to be identified as scientists. That was convenient. Anthropologists commemorate wouldn't have worked as well, so scientists. And then NASA actually released, after there was a lot of news about it, NASA released this image where you saw Oak Mountain in 1986 with a very robust snow cap on it. And then in 2019, when it had lost all of its cover and its glacier. So there was more media around that. And then the event itself brought in a lot of media attention. So what did we learn from that, or how might we kind of think through that in the future? I mean, I think making connections with media sources is very important. Making connections with and working with local people wherever we might be doing projects will be important too. So for the Sister Cities project, working with local communities in Cape Town and in Reykjavik will be fundamental to having that work in a local context. So, I mean, this is a bit repetitious of what we were saying before, but it's about collaborating, with the people who are immediately affected, and maybe just thinking of ourselves as some kind of vehicle or catalyst for bringing some of the research-based work into something that's more public-facing and will be of interest to the media. But I think it's really hard to know exactly what will appeal to media. They do move in packs, as you like to say. So once one big source picks it up, like the Guardian or the BBC, or in our case, the Washington Post over here in the United States, then they follow, right? There's a story that they all are interested in. It also helped that it was the middle of August, which is a slow news time traditionally. And so, we might have gotten more sort of coverage because of that. It was also a historic loss of ice in Greenland at that same time, like 12 billion tons in one day, if I'm remembering the number right. It was a phenomenal amount of ice loss, so that was in the news. And this was also at the time of Greta Thunberg's crossing over to New York from Europe on the solar sailboat. So all of these things kind of converged at the same time and created a kind of ecosystem for climate change communication and news that I think, I suspect sort of fed off of one another in a way.
And I think there might be a whole other conversation to have someday about sort of how to make things newsy, how to make climate and environmental research newsy, because before this, I used to work with news journalists, so I have a good sense of how they think, and that certainly helped us inform in terms of thinking about the timing and the medium. But I kind of think the more broader point is also just to, as if we are scholars, which we are, going into our research projects, is to encourage ourselves, to press ourselves, dare ourselves to think beyond the conventional forms of communication. And just always, I think we used to say in graduate school that every anthropologist got the field site they deserved, for good or for ill.
I never heard that.
That's what they used to say in our graduate program. But I would also say that every research project, have certain media that they can possibly enable or that they can thrive with. And sort of beginning and knowing that, yes, we can always write a book, we can always write an article, that's given. But what else could we do with this project? What other kinds of narratives and media might this project lend itself to? Just to have that kind of backburnering in your mind as you're doing your work is something that I think can be really, and then just trying and, we've talked about our successes. We've had many failures. We've had many things that didn't work so well.
Yes.
And just accept that that's part of an experimental process, and failure is edifying in its own way. And it's just good to not put too much weight on any one thing you're doing, and just to kind of keep encouraging, daring yourself to do different things. That's what I would say.
That's great advice. Our next question is from Paula, who's saying, why do you use Anthropocene rather than Capitalocene? Is there a reason behind considering that not all humans are equally responsible, if at all, for the climate crisis?
Yes, that's a fantastic question, Paula. We've had many discussions about this, and Anthropocene has its concerns, obviously, because it focuses as though there is just one anthropos that is causing this environmental destruction, and clearly some humans are more responsible, both in the past and in the present, for the conditions that are creating the climate crisis. So my use of Anthropocene is not to diminish that or to not recognize that. And in my writing, I'm very explicit about making that point, that some people are more responsible and some will suffer more the consequences. And so we know that. But to my reading, the Capitalocene, in a couple of ways, is problematic in that it only accounts for capitalist systems in the present, in the past, but doesn't take into account other forms of economic systems that were also destructive. And I'm thinking of the Soviet Union, for example, which was quite terrible in terms of its emissions and industrial destruction, that can't sort of be captured by that. But beyond that, it's a kind of I think a sort of a theoretical or a fundamental opposition in my mind to just reducing everything to economy once again. There are so many more dynamics to Anthropocene that are cultural and social and epistemological and generational, that calling it the Capitalocene alone, in my mind, reduces it to simply a kind of economic system, a transactional question, rather than one that takes into account a more robust set of actors and principles and dynamics that, as a cultural anthropologist, I think are quite important in terms of how we're both creating destruction, but also how we might resolve it and come to a resolution. And although Capitalocene was concocted by Donna Haraway and Jason W. Moore, and Andreas Malm was part of it too, in that original iteration, I challenge you to go look at Jason Moore's bibliography. And from a feminist point of view, I have some concerns about Capitalocene as well. I'll stop there, but I would invite you to go look at his bibliography and see who is cited in that work.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun.
Thank you so much for saying that, Simony, because I mean, I have to say, I find the whole Capitalocene thing full of some of these bros as well. And actually, yeah. I completely agree.
Thank you.
I will just say, I mean, it is bro-y a lot of the time,
It's
but I'll say that, both concepts can be used well and both concepts can be used poorly.
Yeah.
The concept's only as good as its utilization.
They're both imperfect. They're both imperfect.
Exactly. And it's what you do with them. But I still do think there's something slightly problematic with who's talking about the capitalist scene only.
Totally.
Yeah, totally, especially from a feminist perspective. Completely agree. So so Amanda Power, who's the co-convener of the network, had a comment which she sort of has reminded me that just on the back of what the two of you said about collaboration and collaboration with artists, this is a little advertisement for what we're doing later in the term, which is that we have a collaboration with the Berlin School of Art, and we're going to have a little roundtable where students who are artists in Berlin are going to be talking about animal eyes on the planet. This is a sort of a collaborative project that we have between Oxford and Berlin on taking on the Anthropocene, the anthropocentrism of the Anthropocene, and reverting it by looking at how non-human animals might be able to represent or talk about the planet. And this is sort of this collaboration, this is why when I was listening to the two of you, it's so inspiring for us, as I said, because we're sort of trying to do very similar work from to what you guys you have so successfully and so beautifully and artistically already done. So thanks, Amanda, for that little reminder.
That sounds fantastic. That sounds like an amazing, amazing project.
Yeah.
I hope.
Sounds like we should be collaborating with you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we should find a way for all of us to collaborate in some way, because honestly, this would be fantastic. One of the good things about this horrible pandemic is that this is normalized now, in the sense that we can have these Zoom sessions. And we were supposed to go to Berlin last spring, but that didn't happen, and we're doing everything virtually. And so perhaps we can find something between the US, Europe, and Berlin. I mean, Berlin is in Europe, but I'm thinking with this Brexited mindset of like, that's Europe, this is Little England. But yeah. Anyway, sorry. Thanks, Amanda, for the reminder. Carl has a follow-up question that basically, I think, I'm sorry, we're out of time, so I might not take it. He's basically saying that Will and Grace is a good example. And what about, we have to think about non-traditional viewers or Daily Mail readers, etc. And he's saying he might introduce you to some TV companies.
Carl, let's talk.
Yeah, exactly. I think that sounds like a good private conversation between Carl and the two of you. Franco Gonzalez has a question where he says, David Simmons' The Wire presented the decay of Baltimore through the lenses of race and class. Will Petropolis use the lens of the unsustainability of high energy intensive ways of life in 20th century America?
Yeah, that's a great, The Wire is another beautiful analog. And again, it's one of these projects that had all sorts of amazing sort of critical insights into the state of American urbanism, from its schools to its governmental system to its media, but did it in the context of just what worked as a simple procedural, sort of police procedural. And the fact that it worked as like a show about essentially kind of cops and robbers, good, sort of drug dealers and investigators. At that level it worked, and then it worked also as social commentary. And I do think that's kind of what we're looking for too. Something that stands on the legs of the genre successfully and is just a good watch, but at the same time is exactly as you're suggesting, Franco, going to use the attention and the sort of the emotional investment to talk about, the ways in which in every respect this megalopolis built in a swamp on the edge of a rising Gulf of Mexico is an absolutely unsustainable way of life. And that's really a big part of what we want to talk about. And
you intuited too, because The Wire actually was one of our very early and fundamental models for Petropolis. And our tagline has been, since we initiated this, where The Wire was about drugs and money, Petropolis is about oil and power. So that's been an important model and inspiration. Yeah.
I have to say, I found your talk incredibly inspirational, not just for the fantastic research you do, but also just the way you're able to, you've been able to really expand the way in which the Academy should respond to the Anthropocene in this moment, so creatively and so evocatively for so much of us. So thank you so much for that. I'm really excited about Petropolis, and I look forward to that, to watching it and, us talking about it in the same vein as we talk about The Wire and Chernobyl.
That would be cool.
That would be so awesome.
Sometime very soon. And thank you so much for being here with us today early in the morning. And I really hope we can find a way to keep this collaboration going in the future, one way or the other. I really want to thank all the participants who've joined us today, and thank you for these fantastic questions and your engagement with this session. We hope to have you back. I'll be in touch with some of our events later in the term. But for the time being, Simony and Dominic, thank you so much for this, and hope to be in touch in other ways.
Yes. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Annika.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dominica.
Take care. Bye.
Future
To future
collaborations.
collaboration.
Thank you.